Well, hello there, listener. I hope you're well. Hope things are going good for you. Feeling a little froggy myself. I'm recording this on a Friday morning, but I was up awful late last night. It's yesterday, speaking at the International Positive Psychology Association's Evidence in Action Conference. It's a positive psychology conference that was really focused at the application piece, right? You can do all this research, but this is always a challenge with a lot of research is like, how does it actually translate to humans out in the world? And it was cool. It was cool to be invited to speak about my work and how I'm taking the concepts and ideas of positive psychology and then applying them to the fitness industry, what that's looked like. I had a few good case studies. It was really fun. We had an awesome Q&A afterwards. And that meant being up far later than I normally am. And I'm recording this on World Sleep Day. Well, there was an irony to World Sleep Day being the same week as daylight savings. And if you listen to last week's podcast episode, it was all about my distaste for daylight savings. I feel like it's an outdated construct. We don't really need it anymore, but we are beholden to it because it is legally regulated. There's all these different movements to dismantle it. And that was what last week's episode was about. But I got some listener feedback of like, hey, you got me curious about sleep. You got me interested in sleep, but you didn't actually tell me anything to do about it. So this episode is going to be about hacking your sleep. How does sleep work in the body? What does sleep do in the brain? Why does it matter so much? And what can you do about it in your own life? And funny enough, on the panel I was on last night was a sleep researcher, Dr. Frederick Brown. And so it was cool to see information that I'm really passionate about from the source, from the font. And had I had more time to schedule this, I would have had Frederick on the show with me talking about this. But, it's kind of a quick turnaround for him. We were having that panel last night, only 12 hours ago. But like I say, it's the great hilarity of talking about sleep when you haven't had enough of it yourself. And I guess maybe part of this, I could also talk about like, well, how do I manage on a day when I'm underslept? And one of the cool things that Frederick Brown said last night in his talk was that it's okay if 1 out of 10 days you have a sleep disruption, that we don't see like a maladaptive effect on the body and the human being if it's like an occasional sleep disruption. So I took comfort in that, knowing that I was going to be just a little bit less of a hypocrite talking about high quality sleep, having been up all night doing this conference. So I think that's a sufficient introduction. So by listener request, this episode's going to be on hacking your sleep. So let's get to it. I'm going to kick off by talking a little bit about the science of sleep so that if you haven't listened to any of the other sleep episodes or taken my sleep workshop, that you're not behind the ball here. And we'll talk about we'll breeze through quickly the benefits of sleep, some sleep myths that you might have heard along the way. And along the way, we're going to assemble like, what is your own sleep game plan? And let's just start with like how sleep works. There's two primary mechanisms to sleep. The first one, and I mentioned Frederick Brown earlier. This was actually part of his research back decades ago. I want to say the 80s was his primary body of research on working on the rhythms of the human body and specifically the circadian clock. So when we say like, your circadian cycle, we're talking about a 24-hour cycle that isn't just sleep hormones. It's a lot of other systems in the body. So hunger and digestion, your heart rate and blood pressure and heart rate variability. It's these peaks and valleys in attention and awareness. But underneath all of that, we're talking about sleep. It's the interchange of cortisol, which we're taught to think of as a stress hormone, but think of it like an arousal hormone. So it peaks just before waking. You kind of rise with it, right? You wake with it. And then it tapers off over the course of the day. Now, in Opposition to cortisol is the hormone melatonin, which most people know as a supplement. But melatonin is something your body naturally produces. So it rises over the course of the day. You fall asleep and then it diminishes as you're sleeping. So they work in opposite waves. Now, the second mechanism of sleep is something called sleep drive. And think of it like this: your brain, everything your brain does, produces a byproduct called adenosine. Totally normal. But as adenosine accumulates, you get more and more tired. And if you go long enough, you won't be able to make yourself stay awake, regardless of where you are in your circadian cycle, because you'll have accumulated sufficient adenosine. And what's interesting about that is, there's no chemical replacement for sleep. So even though I'm going to drink a bunch of coffee this morning, and I love coffee, no shade on coffee, it is an adenosine blocker because it stimulates your adrenal hormones, like adrenaline. I'm sure you heard of that. We'll talk a little bit about like why that matters from an evolutionary perspective, but essentially I need to clean the adenosine out of my brain at night. And that's one of the major mechanisms of sleep. And I think this is super cool. I think it's cool that we've got enough technology to figure this out even. When you fall asleep, you go through 90-minute cycles within your sleep cycle, 90 minutes ish, where you move through the different stages of sleep. And in those 90-minute cycles, as you go into deep sleep, your brain shrinks a little bit and your cerebral cortical fluid floods into the brain, washes the adenosine out by then, like, so it floods in. Think of it like a tide flooding into the beach. Then your brain, as you come out of your deep sleeps, like toward the end of the 90 minutes, your brain swells back up a little bit and it pushes the tide of cerebral cortical fluid back out. And that takes the adenosine with it. And then that's processed by your, normal metabolic processes of cleaning your bodily fluids. It's cool. And then you fall back into deep sleep again because you go through these 90-minute cycles multiple times in the night. You go back down into deep, safe sleep. Your brain shrinks a little. It floods back in, collects all the adenosine. Your brain swells back up. Cerebral cortical fluid retreats, takes the adenosine with it. So it's really this washing action, just like waves on a beach, but it happens over a 90-minute cycle. I think that is super cool. But sleep drive, as adenosine accumulates, you need sleep more and more to prevent it from damaging your brain. And if you think of it most like thirst, if we look at other drives in the body, if you go long enough without water, you will perish. Everybody knows dehydration can be lethal. But the interesting thing is, if you go long enough without sleep, you'll go insane first, but eventually it would kill you because your brain will be compromised in its function. And that is incredible. And that's also why like sleep deprivation is a form of torture, because it's so uncomfortable, because your body needs sleep. One of the cool things to hear Frederick Brown say last night was that when he was first researching sleep, it was considered to be kind of a bad habit. But now we know that it is like a necessary physiological process. And I was teaching my resilience workshop last week at a military services nonprofit. And we talked a bit about sleep as something that like is necessary to care for your biology and why biology matters in resilience. And one of the vets who was on the call was like, hey, as part of my service, I was taught by the military that if you sleep, you're lazy. And he's been having a hard time letting go of that mindset. It was interesting to see how even now, with all of the science and knowledge we have, this pervasive mindset that like people who sleep a lot are just lazy, as opposed to like, no, their brains literally need it. And I know for me, I played rugby in college. I grew up in a really rough and tumble family. I've had multiple traumatic brain injuries. I think I've had 3 or 4 concussions, and I had post-concussion syndrome last time. So when I don't sleep, I become cognitively impaired, and eventually it will make me feel very ill if I don't get enough. So definitely taking naps today. But it's interesting the way that that's culturally shifted. Okay, tangent over. But I think it's important to touch base on this because, like, if we understand that adenosine accumulation damages the brain, right? And now we're seeing that linked, the lack of sleep linked to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, dementia, all these degenerative conditions. We're going to talk a bit about how sleep enhances creativity and performance because your brain can work more effectively. It's more high functioning cognitively, and not to mention the effects on the body. Then it becomes important when you understand that and understand that your adrenaline hormones, your adrenal hormones, block adenosine, your brain's ability to sense adenosine, and why that's important. It changes our behavior. So the reason I dive into all this science is because if I'm going to tell you this is what you do to get good sleep, but you don't understand why, maybe like, I know what I should be doing. But if you know what you should be doing and the why, you can then decide that you want to do it and that it's a choice, a high value choice instead of an obligation. So that's my whys. But it's also cool to consider how we evolved to this place. Because if you think back to our tribal ancestors, if we're all sitting around a fire, chilling, fire's crackling, it's warm and cozy, you're starting to drift off, and then a predator shows up, you'd have a big adrenaline reaction, right? A big spike. It's like when you wake from a really loud noise in the middle of the night and your heart is racing, that's adrenaline. And it's blocking the sleep drive, the adenosine. It's interrupting your sleep cycle because you need to be able in a moment's notice to defend yourself and the things that you care about. That adrenal spike is important, but also much of our modern technologies are causing an adrenal spike, an overstimulation too late in the day. So then we never come down far enough to get the quality of sleep that we want because we're stimulating the adrenal hormones too close to bed, which is blocking melatonin, adenosine blocking, and then you don't drift off. So that's like your real quick primer about sleep, the science underneath it anyway, the mechanisms of it. I'd say the one other thing I didn't mention was the reparative function to tissue. We like to think that when we are exercising is when we are making, I joke with my clients, making fitness. I don't like to call it working out. You're making fitness, you're building it one step at a time. But when we're making fitness, we like to think that that's the moment of improvement. In actuality, exercise is causing intentional controlled damage to the tissues of your body when done properly. And then it is the recovery period where all of the tissues are repaired and built back better than when they first, before you worked out, right? When you first started. And so when we've got this balanced cycle of like workout, which is damage, sleep, which is recovery, over time we build improvement. But if we're just working out without adequate recovery, you're doing damage and then doing more damage and then doing more damage and increasing your likelihood of injury, of overtraining, of generally feeling kind of gross. So there is a reparative function to sleep where damaged tissue is repaired, used resources are restored, and all of these physiological mechanisms are improved while you are resting. So if you're compromising sleep, you're also compromising tissue restoration, which is, I think, really important for those of you who are fitness minded listening to the show. So that in that way, sleep is really part of the like bigger, faster, stronger, like whatever your fitness goals might be. It's also shown in studies to improve cognition. You have greater problem solving and idea generating skills. So it literally makes you more creative. Sleep is an important part of emotional regulation. People who are shown to be underslept have less prefrontal cortex activation because, the prefrontal cortex, which is like the part of your brain that is just behind and above your eyes, that's where emotional regulation lives. And it's really sensitive to adenosine accumulation. And it's like if you've ever seen, the last time I did this workshop, I used the word toddler, my sleep workshop. I said, like, if you've ever seen a toddler throw a tantrum, it's like that. And somebody in the workshop piped up, it's like nothing compared to a teenager. I'm like, noted, never Don't have that much teenager tantrum throwing exposure, but I can imagine it. Um, Toddlers don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. Funny enough, neither do teenagers. They're just further along. So they lack the same degree of emotional regulation that an adult would have. Now, most adults, I'd like to say, most, I hope, are able to control, in some degree, they have self regulation of their emotions. But if you've ever had that feeling of you're so tired that you can't control yourself, you're just losing it, that's got too much adenosine in that prefrontal cortex. And so you've got less control. So I believe, societies run on emotional regulation, our ability to control and interact with one another. So sleep becomes an important part of that. You live longer. There's blue zone studies, which are studies of areas that have the most active centenarians. So it's the most active people over the age of 100, show that those cultures that produce people that live over 100 have high prioritization of sleep and of stress avoidance, and stress increases your likelihood of not sleeping. And it makes you more productive. Right? You're better able to focus and prioritize tasks when you've slept. So whatever it is that you're about, hopefully I've now convinced you that sleep matters and that you care about it. A quick note on if you're convinced that it's important, but you're not convinced that you're not sleeping enough, let me just throw out the 3 ways that you can really tell if you're getting enough sleep. If you wake up feeling like you need caffeine to function, that is a sign that you didn't clear out all your adenosine. Your cortisol is not rising in its appropriate rhythms because it should wake you up. And you're drinking the caffeine to stimulate your adrenal hormones to get you the rest of the way there. So that's kind of one big checkbox. If you find yourself rereading things that aren't that challenging or unable to perform cognitive tasks that aren't that hard, that's a sign that you are not functioning at your full speed. Another one that you're a little bit sleep deprived. And then the last one, I always make a big joke of this when I teach the sleep workshop, but it's that you can't wake up without an alarm, especially if you have to set multiple alarms. Because if you'd gotten enough sleep, you would have woken up on your own. So needing the alarm, struggling to wake with the alarm, being pissed off at the alarm, those are signs that you are not lining up your current life cycle, like day-to-day life, with your natural circadian cycle. Or you're not going to bed early enough to wake at the time that you need to. Frederick Brown also talked about last night that you can't really re-hardwire the biological set point of your natural circadian cycle. And I talked about this a little bit in last week's episode, that like circadian misalignment has ramifications physiologically long term. And so if you took a 2-week relaxing vacation, not a lot of stimulation, just chilling, going to the beach, like what sleep and waking rhythm would you fall into on your own? That's your natural circadian cycle. What I've found, I'm a lark, means I wake up really early, typically with or just before the sunrise. And I fall asleep earlier than most people. And I know this because my family, my giant, ridiculous, obnoxious, loud family, goes on vacation together for about a week to the beach every year. And my brothers and their wives and my little sisters, they'll all stay up late. They're laughing, my mom, blah, blah. I'm asleep before some of them have finished dinner. And if I don't do that, I'm horribly grumpy the whole time. So I do miss out on a little bit of fun that way, but it's how I know that's my circadian rhythm and I need to respect that. So if you're able to sync your lifestyle, and granted, not all of us are able to, but you do see a better physiological benefit to owning up, like, nah, this is just how my body works, and living in that lifestyle. I want to talk a little bit about supplementation before we get into the biohacking, just so you understand how these chemicals exchange. I've thumped on coffee quite a bit, but when I say coffee, I mean caffeine. Caffeine stimulates adrenaline and adrenal hormones, which wake you because you no longer directly hormonally accessing the accumulation of your sleep drive. There is no chemical replacement for sleep. So you can't take a nootropic or drink a lot of lion's mane or drink a lot of coffee or tea and not need sleep anymore. All you're doing is like putting your finger in the dam as the holes are punching through. So eventually you got to pay the piper in one way or another, either by sleeping or you're going to develop some of these maladaptive physiological effects. Now, the thing to note here is that circadian cycle is hormonal. So anything you are regularly delivering into your body at a particular time of day on a regular rhythm is going to be wired into that circadian cycle. So your physiology comes to expect that cup of coffee upon waking. Then as your caffeine starts to, like the adenosine, sorry, let's try that again. Then as your adrenaline starts to taper off, you start feeling drowsy again because you didn't actually process the adenosine. You're in the afternoon, you want another cup of coffee. So you have one, but it stimulates your adrenal hormones again. And so when it's time to sleep, your adrenal hormones are still upregulated, and that's giving you that tired but wired feeling. And you can't quite get to sleep because the hormonal rhythm has been compromised. And that's where recommendations like don't drink coffee after noon, or my personal rule is 2 p.m. The reason that we struggle to give a concrete recommendation on that is that everyone has different processing of caffeine due to their biology, specifically how quickly they metabolize caffeine in the liver. It's a liver enzyme thing. But even fast caffeine metabolizers still have a problem with sleep if they drink coffee late. They'll tell you they don't, but the research says they do. They will be able to fall asleep, but the quality of sleep, the access to deep sleep, which is the physiological repairing sleep, that gets compromised. So there's 3 stages of sleep. There's light stage. That's when you're just kind of nodding off. That's your 20-minute power nap sleep. There's deep sleep. That's where you get tissue repair, reparative functions of sleep. And then the REM sleep is when you get memory consolidation. It's when you dream. It's funny. So when I first started doing this workshop, it was like, 2 stages of light sleep, and now there's like 4 or whatever. But the reason I break it down into those 3 categories is because most people's activity trackers are in those 3 categories. And you do need all 3 because all 3 are important. But alcohol, caffeine, THC, I've not seen anything about CBD being a blocker, but I know some people who say they wake up foggy if they have too much. They block deep phase sleep. So yeah, you slept, but you wake up feeling like a bag of hammers because you didn't get into deep sleep, and therefore you didn't repair, you didn't clean the adenosine, your tissues are still sore. Your muscles are still sore, like your body doesn't feel good because those things were blocked. So that's a big one, is the caffeine thing. The other big supplement that comes up a lot is melatonin. And there's a lot of myths about melatonin. I'll just unpack really quickly. You naturally produce melatonin. Like, you've got it in your body. Unless you have some kind of medical problem. And I'm going to throw out there, if when I said like, you should have 1 out of 10 nights be undisrupted sleep, and you're like, I wish. If you, without having kids, I don't like your dog jump on your bed, if you are struggling to get high quality sleep, there's something going on. If you give yourself 9 hours and you wake up and you still don't feel good, like, speak with a sleep professional. And there are some people that need to supplement melatonin, so I don't want to knock that. But for the average person, you're taking melatonin and you're falling asleep 15 minutes later. That's the placebo effect, because melatonin takes 30 to 60 minutes to metabolize, right? To get into your bloodstream and take an effect in your body. And the placebo effect is still in effect. Like it's important, but there are other ways to create a placebo effect that help you fall asleep that aren't supplementing a hormone. Because as we already mentioned, routinely supplementing anything that shifts your hormonal profile then becomes wired into your circadian cycle. And that's why changing and stopping become uncomfortable. So if you are going to take melatonin, take it at least half an hour before you want to go to bed. And then don't do anything overstimulating. Like go to bed because you need to ride that gentle slumber on down, because melatonin is also pretty easy to override with things like your phone or watching TV, um, and really anything stimulating, because it doesn't take much from your adrenal hormones to override that mechanism of sleep. So ride the drowsy down. I would say for me, I take melatonin when I need to shift my sleep cycle. So this would be like back when I was traveling, or if I need to get up much, much earlier than I normally do. So I need to make myself go to sleep early. I'll take melatonin to induce that shift in sleep. Anybody who's a shift worker, or like, my sister's a nurse who occasionally has to do a shift at an odd time. It's a good way if you're like, okay, I got to be to work at 8, I got to be up at 7. I guess I need to make myself go to sleep at like 10. I take my melatonin at 9, even though I normally stay up till midnight. That would induce sleep early, and then you're able to get up without too much disruption. So then let's talk about actually hacking your sleep now that you've got all of this information. Generally, whenever it comes to any lifestyle shifting, what I suggest is that you change the easiest things first. Even if there is an optimal order recommended by the practitioner, there is the optimal order that what's going to work in your life, and you should work within that. So, first thing is, I just recommend that you figure out what your circadian cycle is. Meaning, like, do you naturally wake up at 5 a.m.? My dad naturally wakes up at like 3, 4, probably 4. So he's in bed at like 7 o'clock, and he's happy as a clam doing it. But what's your natural? And the trick here is that many people that I've worked with try to tell me that they're a night owl. But night owls are only like 9% of the population. And there's no way that like 60% of my clients just happen to be part of that 9%. What it actually turns out is that they're on their phones, they're watching TV, they're eating dinner way too late. So they are stimulating their bodies, and then they can't fall asleep at the time that they really should be for their circadian rhythm. Like they're getting sleepy at like 9, but then they're overstimulating themselves until midnight. And then they wonder why their sleep is compromised. Now, part of that is deep sleep falls very early in the sleep cycle. You get more deep sleep in the early end of your 8 or hours or whatever. So if you miss your going to bed window and still fall asleep, you'll miss that deep restorative sleep. So you want to get to bed at a consistent time within like a 1-hour window of itself. And you want to get in bed early enough that you give yourself time to fall into sleep. So figure out, are you a night owl? Are you one of the 9%? Are you one of the gifted chosen? I'm a lark. We covered that. Or are you just normal? It's called a hummingbird, where you rise with the sun and you get sleepy around dusk and you just let that ride. So gather enough data to know. You can do that by using a widget that tracks your sleep. You can sleep journal. You can get apps for that. You can get an actual physical notebook if you want, but get enough information to be like, yes, this is when I get sleepy, and this is when I tend to wake up. And then you want to prep your space. So you want your room to be dark. There's a lot of studies around melatonin production and light in the room that you're sleeping in. So your room should be pretty dark. We've even covered all of the LEDs on everything in the apartment, so that it doesn't bleed even a little bit of light. Makes it fun when you got to get up in the middle of the night, if you do have to get up in the middle of the night. But we figure it out. So your room should be pretty dark. Should be cool. Should be in the like mid high 60s. Um, and that's because as you fall asleep, your body temperature drops subtly. And you want that temperature drop off effect. And we're going to talk a bit in a second about, like I say, there's ways to prime the placebo effect so that you'll fall asleep faster. That's going to be relevant in a second. And then the last thing, you want it to be quiet enough. And it doesn't have to be quiet like at the grave, because that's actually creepy and unnerving. What it should kind of feel like is like the crackling of the fire or like the dog dozing near you, because our ancestors would have been sleeping with like the noise of about 30 people close by. So not like, but what we're looking for here is no percussive, sharp noise. So if you're in an environment where there is percussive and sharp noise, you want to have a noise machine set to have a high enough decibel to make that noise even. So it's not like loud, quiet, which is what startles us awake. But you don't want it so quiet that it's unnerving, right? If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and you're like, it's too quiet. That's that thing of like, where's my tribe? So you can set your room. The other thing I like to add to that, it's not in like the official prescriptions, but I like to say like, get really comfy sheets. Get things that are physically, tactilely comforting so that if you do wake up in the night, you can just tell yourself like, that's okay. I'll fall asleep. This is so cozy. Because sleep is the only drive that you can affect with your psychology. I can't make myself not thirsty by thinking I'm not thirsty, but I can make myself stay awake by creating enough anxiety that my adrenal hormones climb. So making it cozy, you can then choose to think like comforting thoughts about your environment, and it gives you something to focus on, I think. So the next gets into, all right, you know your circadian rhythm, the environment's prepped. What are you going to do now? I suggest that you start by setting yourself a no more screens point in the evening. And this is the point where you're going to turn down the artificial light in your environment to a dimmer light. You're going to read a book, listen to the radio, do things that are not loud and bright. And yes, that includes television, because your TV, your phone, your screen of your computer, even the light in your fridge makes blue light. And blue light is stimulating us in the same way the bright blue light that is called our sky stimulates us. And we want to, the circadian cycle is very closely tied to the sun. So when you wake and you get bright early morning light, it actually helps to prime your circadian cycle. We're going to talk about that as a hacking trick in a second. But even alarming noises are going to stimulate you. So loud music, watching violent television, anything like that is going to mess up your ability to fall asleep. So you could start by just cleaning up. What does your evening look like in the 2 hours before bed? And yes, 2 hours. People are always like, I can't do 2 hours. I'm like, okay, we'll start with one. But your goal should be the last few hours of your day to like bring it down, to connect with people around you, and to prepare yourself for this like lovely, necessary physiological process. But I don't know about you. I really like sleeping. You want to then set up the room to also have gently moving air. You want to set up comforting evening behaviors. And set yourself a get into bed time. Because setting yourself a fall asleep time, meh, because you can't make yourself do it. But if you know, most people need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. It's a very small percentage of the population that need less than 7. If you're telling yourself you need less than 7, you're probably wrong. Mostly statistically probably wrong, if you're listening to the show. But if you need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep and you have to be up at 7 a.m., We've got to count back. Got to be asleep by 10. Then your get into bedtime should be like 9:30, which means your prep for sleep time would be like 9 p.m. So count it back and start setting up those prep times. Now, the trick here is unless you are sleepy, you can't make yourself fall asleep. But if you've been routinely waking up at that time, you probably have been getting sleepy at that moment, but overstimulating yourself if you've been having trouble falling asleep. Um, it's easier to set waking time first because if you've been falling asleep too late, it's hard to make yourself fall asleep if you're not sleepy. But when you experience sleepiness, that's your brain, your body, your physiology telling you that your circadian cycle is like, hey, I'm ready to sleep right now. But if you're stimulating yourself, you're keeping yourself awake. Now consider that the only time that that would have happened to our ancestors is if there was a threat. And the only way to keep ourselves awake is by stimulating adrenal hormones. So then when you're like, why can't I fall asleep? Well, it's because you overrode the system of sleepiness by telling your like physical animal of a body that there was a threat. Because it can't tell the difference between like the banging on the television and like the threat of someone at the door. That's why we prime ourselves for sleep. I've always liked the idea that your good night's sleep is going to be built on how you lived your life the day before. Because movement, a moderate intensity movement that is more than an hour away from bedtime, is going to help with sleep. You can overtrain and overstimulate yourself. And limiting alcohol within 2 hours of bed. Everyone balks at that one too, because like, but that's so early. Yeah, but alcohol will block your deep phase sleep. So where's your priority? Is it on the second glass of wine or is it waking up tomorrow feeling like a rock star? So it blocks REM, it blocks deep phase sleep. But I mentioned before the temperature drop off effect and the ways in which that we can hack the temperature drop off effect. So this is the placebo effect and priming yourself to sleep. We talked about limiting screens, we talked about low light. But if you take a warm bath or a nice hot shower, it raises your core body temperature. And then you can ride that dropping. You go into your cool bedroom, your body temperature starts to drop, you're going to get sleepy. And so you can prime the temperature drop off effect of your natural decrease in body temperature with a warm bath. And that's why like a warm milk or cocoa or whatever will help you fall asleep. Because you've raised your body temperature just a little bit. Now you're riding the wave back down. And for all this stuff, just shoot for good enough. Shoot for a most days approach. Be patient. Sleep takes a long time to shift. Normally, if I have someone shifting their sleep schedule, so let's say they have been sleeping from midnight to 6 and they feel crappy, I'll try to walk them back for 20-minute increments for their bedtime. Probably every 3 or 4 days, 20 minutes back, 20 minutes back, 20 minutes back in their bedtime. If we think that their circadian cycle falls into that window. I recognize that not everyone has the kind of flexibility where you can just like choose when you go to sleep. That's life. But if you do have that flexibility, set it to your circadian cycle and do yourself a favor. So quick summary, because I know I've been kind of all over the place here. You can blame my lack of sleep and my slow cognition. You want your room to be dark, cool, and have a murmury background noise. And you can use a white noise machine if you need to. You want to shut off screens, limit alcohol 2 hours before you want to be asleep. You want to limit caffeine afternoon. You can push it to like 2. Anything after that, it's going to mess you up. You can utilize the temperature drop-off effect by taking a shower as part of a hot shower or a warm bath as part of your bedtime ritual. And that bedtime ritual should start around the time that your screens are off, or, just start getting into the cozy rhythm of the evening. Melatonin, naturally occurring hormone, you can supplement it. If you're going to do that, take it at least 30 minutes before you get into bedtime so that it's kicking in around the time you want to be falling asleep. And once you're in that window, don't do anything that's going to overstimulate you. It could be loud noises, it could be bright lights, it could even be less bright lights. Consider that looking at your phone is like staring at the sun. As far as your brain is concerned, it doesn't know the difference. Right? Consider that your sensory organs are ancient, and your mind is not going to be able to override them no matter how much it thinks, no matter how smart it thinks it is. If you need an alarm to wake, you didn't get enough sleep. Sorry. Um, and one of the best things that you can do for your sleep is to get bright early morning light upon waking. So go outside, look up at the sky, open your eyes nice and wide. That's one of the ways to tell your circadian cycle to increase your cortisol at that time of day because the sun's up. That's about it for sleep. It's a lot of info dump. Love to hear your questions. You can find me on Instagram at darlene.coach. The best way to reach me is through those DMs. And we'll leave it there. Thanks.